Hi, I'm Steve Lando, Tax Chair of Anchin's Law Firm Services Group. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Law Talk. With me is Brendan Kurpis, a Senior Manager in the Law Firm Services Group. Today, Brendan is going to discuss some of the changes relating to the new New York City Pass-Through Entity Tax, or PTET. So, Brendan, before we get started, maybe just a brief overcap of the PTET regimes.
Yes, both New York State and City, along with a couple dozen other states, enacted a pass-through entity taxes as a state and local tax workaround to the $10,000 SALT cap. As these are new tax regimes, and they've continued to evolve as more and more taxpayers have elected in over the past year and a half, and issues were identified. A pass-through entity tax basically turns a previously non-deductible personal income tax payment into a federally deductible entity-level tax payment, effectively reducing your federal taxable income and self-employment income from your partnership or S corporation.
So, what's actually new in the world of New York City PTET?
So the recent legislation signed by Governor Hochul, it accelerated the effective date of the new optional New York City pass-through entity tax. This tax is for partnerships with at least one resident partner and resident S corporations, those with all New York City resident shareholders.
So, Brendan, the New York City Unincorporated Business Tax, or UBT, doesn't that actually already function as a sort of PTET?
Yes, but while that credit for the UBT could be up to 100%, for most of our client base, it is limited to 23%. Here, the new tax will be imposed at the city's highest personal income tax rate of 3.876% and will contain an offsetting individual tax credit, same as New York State allows. For a married New York City taxpayer, this top tax rate kicks in at $90,000 of taxable income and $50,000 for a single filer. The New York City pass-through entity tax will be calculated on all the New York City resident shareholders' taxable income to the extent that they are included in the New York City taxable income of that partner.
So, basically, the UBT credit may give us a 0.5% to 1% of a credit, depending upon apportionment, versus almost 4% for the New York City PTET. What about S corps?
So this is similar to how New York State is treating S corporations with all New York resident shareholders. Recent New York State legislation contained a provision that permits resident S corporations to take advantage of a larger tax benefits under the state's pass-through entity tax regime. Under the new rules, beginning in tax year 2022, S corporations with 100% New York resident shareholders will be allowed to remit pass-through entity taxes on all the income allocated to these resident shareholders, rather than the rule for 2021, which limited the tax to the New York apportioned income.
So, how does the election work logistically?
So for those choosing to elect into this New York City tax, an initial irrevocable annual election by March 15th, 2023 will be required, and the new city PTET will be available starting 1/1/2022.
Okay. And who actually can make the election?
So as we mentioned earlier, this tax is for partnerships with at least one New York City resident partner and resident S corporations with all New York City resident shareholders. Additionally, as the New York City PTET will be reported with the New York State PTET, effectively creating one combined filing for both taxes, an entity must have elected into that New York State pass-through entity tax in order to elect into the New York City pass-through entity tax. For tax years 2023 and forward, the election will need to be made in March of that year, or in other words, March 15th, 2023 for tax year 2023, same as the New York State pass-through entity tax election.
And what about estimates at the entity level for the New York City PTET?
For tax year 2022, electing entities are not required to make estimated tax payments for New York City, but cash basis taxpayers will look to make the payment before December 31st, 2022, in order to capture the federal deduction in the current year of 2022. For tax years 2023 and forward, estimated payments will be required, equaling 25% of the required annual payment, which is 90% of the current year tax or 100% of the prior year tax.
Brendan, what's the effect on individuals with regard to, for example, their estimates?
Unfortunately, New York City guidance states that New York City residents must continue to pay their 2022 estimated tax payments as if they are not entitled to this New York City PTET credit, similar to how New York State's PTET regime was implemented in 2021. New York City residents will claim their share of the PTET credit starting on the 2022 tax returns on Form IT 653, which will be attached to their New York State income tax return.
Brendan, that was great. Thanks for the update. And thank you all for joining us for today's edition of Law Talk. We look forward to seeing you soon, including for our upcoming session on the economics of the New York City PTET.